Recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I'm just sort of getting ourselves set up. I was going to yield some time to a fellow member for a moment, but I think that member has disappeared. We're going to try something tonight, and for anyone watching and listening, if you don't like lots of geeky conversation and lots of math, this isn't your night to watch. We're going to try to walk through a handful of concepts. One is one we've been discussing with our economic team. Look, I'm blessed to be on Ways and Means, but I also am the senior Republican for Joint Economics, so I have a handful of PhD economists, and we've been sort of trying to understand what the Federal Reserve is doing and inflation and why it's becoming so difficult to crush inflation in our society and our economy. Then we're going to walk through some numbers so there's an absolute understanding of what's happened, particularly to the working middle class in this country. Demonstrate how much poorer they are today than even a couple years ago in purchasing power, and the reality of just how devastating inflation is to people. People that save, people that tend to have a retirement, actually people who just are trying to make a living and survive. And we're going to show some charts just demonstrating how much poorer Americans are. And then we're going to do some walking through Democrat policy, particularly from the last couple of years, and sort of show the fact that their math is not lining up with what we're seeing. Their math is not lining up with other economists. And the reason for that is, at the same time, we're going to also talk about how much debt has been created in the last couple of years, that what was demographics, we're getting older as a society, and actually what was just spending priorities of the left. Then we'll spend a little bit of time, and much of this, we're running and gunning. We got the president's budget a couple hours ago. We're trying to assemble an understanding, but just a demonstration of here's the tax hikes, here's the spending priorities, and trying to also run ahead of the propaganda mills that are often what our modern media is on, they're going to cut the deficit. No, they're not. There may be, they claim $3 billion. Well, there's like $3 trillion over the 10, but it's a time where there was going to be 20 trillion of borrowing. So, okay, and that's if every tax hike goes in, and it does not slow down the economy. So, first off, a concept. Federal Reserve, when they're raising interest rates, when they're rolling off the book of bonds, all the holdings they have, even mortgage-backed paper, what are they doing? No, seriously, I need everyone to sort of think this through. What are they doing? They're basically pulling liquidity out of the economy. They're removing the cash. Because the previous couple of years, pandemic, whatever excuse you want to give, this body pumped massive amounts of liquidity. Here's checks. We're not going to ask you to work. You don't have to participate in the economy. All that cash is sitting out there. And then you hit everything from supply chain issues to manufacturing issues to people saying, I get money, I don't have to participate in the economy, so I don't have to work. Get inflation. Remember our high school economics classes. What is inflation? Simplest definition, too many dollars chasing too few goods and services. Okay. So why has the interest rate hikes and the pulling of liquidity out, because remember, the Federal Reserve is doing more than just raising interest rates. They're letting their balance sheet books roll off, and by rolling that off, that should also be stripping much liquidity. Why isn't it working? I mean, there's certain things we're seeing. Commodity prices seem to be coming down. Wage hikes are not keeping up, though, with current inflation, which is a really bad thing. But if you look at every model we had, second quarter last year, third quarter, fourth quarter last year, we should be much further in the progress on knocking down inflation than we are. And I know there was some dodgier economic news today, but yesterday, you remember seeing the 2-year Treasury bill going over 5%. And it fell, but just the fact that it hit, I think, like that's one of the all-time highs in modern times. It lets you understand how much of the market thought inflation staying with us longer. And our economists actually came back with a theory. So you have the Federal Reserve trying to pull liquidity out, but on the other side of this equation, you have fiscal policy. This Congress, when it was controlled by the left, our Democrat brothers and sisters put so much cash, so much money into the economy, whether it be, as we start to walk through some of the things that were happening, the American Rescue Plan, the omnibus bills that actually raised spending. You add everything from even the CHIPS Act, all these other things, where you're pumping in money. So do you understand what point I'm trying to make is, if you cannot line up fiscal policy, and fiscal policy is what we do in Congress, and what happens when it's working contrary to monetary policy. Monetary policy is what the Federal Reserve does. And we're starting to actually see a really, really interesting, let's call it an academic debate, except it hurts people. I'm a Congress idiot standing up here going, you understand this and that, but ultimately these numbers hurt people. And I'm going to show you how much poorer most Americans are today. And so, how many times have you heard any member of Congress get behind these microphones and say, maybe we really should think about our spending priorities, either stripping some of the spending that happened last year under Democrat control and saying, okay, maybe that's the program the left will fall on their sword for, maybe spread it out over more time so it's not working contrary to what the Federal Reserve is trying to do in knocking down inflation. It's an interesting thought, but it's worth thinking about. That the financial markets, the old days of inflation is always a monetary issue. Okay, I'll make you the argument that the Federal Reserve in the previous years, when they were buying so much of U.S. sovereign debt, they were like the uncle who keeps buying the alcoholic son bottles of scotch. They were enablers. They made it so we didn't have a penalty. Except now it's time for us to start going to our AA meetings, and we don't have a driver's license anymore. We're not getting there. It's not happening. And we're having a little trouble getting to the first step. What is the first step? You admit you have a problem. So this one is important. And let me know. I'm sure the AA references work, but that was top of mind. How much has President Biden added to the deficit in these last couple of years? Okay. I want to be a little careful on this. There's this running argument here saying, well, the left will say, well, your incentives to grow the economy, your tax reforms, this and that, that's all what added all of it. And we will turn and say, well, Democrats, it's all your spending. I'm partially pointing this out in reference to also why haven't we been able to knock down inflation more? And it's this spending. And when you start to realize that it's functionally well over $5 trillion of additional spending that the Democrats created over the last couple of years. Okay, you may love it, you maybe think your priorities, fine. But then understand how much poorer you are through inflation, because this actually worked contrary to trying to slow inflation down. So it's the concept of fiscal policy crashes into monetary policy, and then you start to wonder why the high school math we were all taught on how this is supposed to work isn't working. So let's actually walk through what we've done to working men and women in this country. I represent the Scottsdale, Phoenix area. For most of the last 2 years, my neighborhoods have had the highest inflation in America. So when America's over here saying, we had 8% inflation, it's devastating, I'm having 13.1. You're just that hard-working person in my community, and you've had your teeth kicked in. And this is important, and I'm heartbroken we don't talk about this more. Inflation has dramatically reduced workers' purchasing power, but let's go all the way 10 years. So you had a 2% and a 2% and a 1.8 and a 2.3 over the last, and then you hit the last 2 years. So let's actually say in 2013 you're making $60,000 a year, and you haven't had a pay increase, so you understand sort of the baseline. You're making $60,000 in 2013, and you kept the same salary. Now that's 10 years. Dear Lord, I hope you've been being paid more, but let's say you're not. That $60,000 today would only buy $46,000 worth of goods. You've gone from $60,000 of purchasing power in the 10 years to $46,000. In 2021, functioning that single year, if you're being paid $60,000 by the end of the year, you functionally lost about $8,000 of purchasing power. And that's the mean. In my state, in my community, it was substantially more than this. Do you understand where that money went? This is something, and I promise you this is going to be a little bit more geeky. That's actually a word. Where does the money go? When we devalue your salary, when we devalue your currency, where does that money go? To borrower. We take it from borrowers and those who actually, what's the easiest way to say this? We took your salary, your savings, we devalued it, and we put it over here to those of us who borrow. Who's the biggest borrower? United States government. So we are going to now pay back the debt with inflated dollars. Now, it's not a magical free option. You didn't suddenly say, hey, we got $30 trillion of debt. We're going to pay it back with dollars now that are only worth 90 cents. Isn't this neat? We took 10 cents off of our debt. No, we didn't. What we did is we stripped it from you. We taxed you, and you didn't even know it. You do understand. Because we stripped the value of your salary, the value of your savings, it was functionally transferred to the United States Treasury and devaluing the debt when we pay it back. How many Americans understand the last 2 years, I think statistically, may be the largest tax hikes in modern history? We made you poorer. There's even some crazy math out there, if you take a look, that will show you debt to GDP, at least for like a month, flattens a bit because the economy continues to grow nominally over inflation or at inflation, and that the debt, we're going to pay it back with the inflated dollars, actually stable. So also, hey, doesn't this look great? Except the very next day, now you need to float the next refinance of your bonds or the new debt, and it's at the higher interest rates, and boom, the little pretend value you got is stripped away from you. So you may be paying back the U.S. sovereign debt with inflated dollars, but now you're paying a hell of a lot more interest. And that's why I started in the comment, did you watch the debt markets this last week? They're all over the place. We refer to that as fragility. We are carrying so much debt, and it's about to get dramatically worse. How many times have I been behind this microphone, walking through, showing you and showing you and showing you? In functionally 10 years, the wheels come off. And the danger that I was terrified of over the last couple of days of what happens if, hey, the debt interest rate cycle You know, that 2-year yesterday being over 5%. What if that lasted for a year, 2 years, 3 years? All the CBO projections we're working on are wrong. Now, I hope today's retrenchment in the numbers is a good thing, but it also may be a thing because we're hurting people. So this is the next part of this moral argument. We've made you poor. You do understand what the Federal Reserve may have to do to you. They may have to take a substantial portion of this society and put you out of work. That misery, we may have to put you out, they may have to put you out of work. And part of it's because Congress kept spending, making it even harder for the Federal Reserve to bend the inflation curve. And yes, I understand there's supply issue, demand issues. They pumped in too much liquidity. The Democrats did all this spending. It got ahead of it. Policies here are really hurting people. So let's take a little bit more look at how this math works. I'm going to do it again. Your 2021 salary. So in a single year, you're making 60 grand. Its purchasing power is 52. If you live in my district, it's probably about 47. How much should your salary go up? Because if you live in my community in Arizona, if you didn't functionally get about a 13% pay hike in the previous year, you are poorer today. If you look at it from 2013 to today, once again, your purchasing power when you used to have 60 grand, let's say you were a saver, you had $60,000 you've saved. You do realize today, and this is functioning at the beginning, the very beginning of the year, you basically only have 46,000 in the bank. You may think you have 60,000, but the purchasing power has been lost so much. So let's actually walk through one of the things I believe is another fraud that's being committed on the American people. And that's when our brothers and sisters on the left did all their legislation last year to functionally subsidize, as I almost prefer to say, soft nationalize so much of the economy. They did all sorts of projections on what certain things were going to cost. So I'm going to use a couple of these. There was functionally a tax credit for battery production. CBO, Congressional Budget Office, put out this score. Said, hey, it's only going to be about $30 billion. Only. Now we have outside economists looking at it, reading the statute, saying, hey, it doesn't actually say $30 billion. What it says is anyone doing this, you get these tax credits. And then they looked at how many people were doing that. We're seeing articles coming in now. It may be as high as $195 billion. This is one of the great scams around here. Put together a piece of legislation saying, hey, you're going to get the tax credit, but then don't put a cap on it, so it just keeps going. Because let's be honest, who writes checks to the Democrats? So, as we're dealing with the budget issues, will our brothers and sisters on the left at least work with us saying, hey, you promised America that this particular battery tax credit would not exceed $30.6 billion. Okay. Will you lock in a cap? Remember the fragility concept when lots of the statute didn't cap the money, so it looked like it's going to cost dramatically more. Will you work with us? Will you cap it? You think that's going to happen around here? So let's take a look at some more of this. Cost estimates on the wind production. You may love wind, but once again, Congressional Budget Office and the piece of legislation the Democrats did last year, which was actually an expansion of the tax credits on wind, they promised us it would come in at $11.2 billion. Now the outside economists are looking at the legislation once again and saying, hey, there's a math problem. They didn't actually cap it. It may come in as high as $68.4 billion. Is that a fraud on the American people? Of course it is. But that's the way the scam here works. Produce a piece of legislation, tell everyone, hey, it's only going to cost this much. But the point I'm going is that Inflation Reduction Act, which is an Orwellian name for a piece of legislation that spent money and actually helped set off inflation. But you start to understand why so many of the big spenders, the people that get these, were just giddy. They actually read the language. So my challenge to our friends on the left, saying, okay, this was your promise, $11.2 billion. Will you cap it at that? Because the modeling now is coming in at maybe as high as $68 billion. This is why we end up in so much trouble here. So now let's actually take a look at, and I'm not going to try to read all these to you. If any of you have insomnia, please go grab the president's budget. Remember, Nancy Pelosi used to stand behind that microphone over there and tell us, budgets are your ethics, your priorities. Okay, we're going to look at a lot of the left's priorities here. This is just one of a couple boards of tax hikes. Tax hike after tax hike after tax hike. And I cannot wait till we try to figure out some way to model these tax hike boards and try to understand what's the level that this actually slows down the economy. And you're going to see some boards here where I'm going to make the argument that the duplicity we're seeing in the president's budget, it just blows off the page. With the amount of the GDP, the size of our economy that's going to go to taxes, and then to pretend it's still going to grow. So, it would be that would be cruel and unusual punishment to read through these. But understand, this is just one board, two boards. These are all the proposed tax hikes that are in the president's budget. And then they're going to tell you this nice thing saying, we're raising taxes enough to reduce the deficit over the next decade by $3 trillion. They forget to mention we're borrowing 20. And so I put a little board together saying, if every single one of their tax hikes come in and every single one of them produces the revenue that they scored it at, and these actually haven't been they're just baseline scores. There's no actually analytics behind it. And it doesn't actually slow down the economy and doesn't actually now create incentives for people to put their resources in other places other than these areas that have all had the tax hikes. It might produce $3 trillion over the 10 years. Okay, great. We're heading towards a projected cumulated deficit from 2024 budget to the 2033, so functioning 9 budget years of $20 trillion. If you have someone on the left run around here saying, we're doing something for deficit reduction, something where you basically go from, hey, we were going to hit 118% of GDP in 2033 of debt to GDP, where they might bring it in if they got all their taxes and all the revenues came in and they don't slow down the economy, they might hit 110%. So let's walk through what's being proposed to us. Remember, we're just starting. We're digging through this as fast as we can, and we're trying to, once again, understand their priorities. So just some of the basic taxes. Over the next 10 years, the budget process, an average level of taxation has been about 19.7%, which is actually higher, I think, than the historic average. But you basically look at higher than any 10 years. Let me rephrase that. The 19.7% of GDP going into taxes. That's functioning the baseline math of the president's budget. You do realize that functionally is higher than any time in modern history. And I've been here before over and over and shown the charts that saying here's really high marginal tax rates. We get about 18% of GDP in taxes. Here's really low marginal tax rates. We get about 18% of GDP. I'm just wondering what magic wand the left is waving that's all of a sudden we're now going to start getting close to 20% of the economy in taxes. Maybe they come up with some magical way to do it. The problem here, this is the president's own budget. So you just saw, what was it, 19.7% of the economy coming in taxes. The new spending is at 24.8% of the economy. And then we're going to have people running around here, particularly on the left, saying, look what we did for deficit reduction. Huh? And trust me, there's no saints here. The hardest thing I say over and over and over, and I probably get more hate from this, but it's absolutely mathematically true. From today through the next 30 years, 100% of future U.S. sovereign debt, 100% of future sovereign debt is demographics. It's baby boomers. We got old. If you're someone screaming at the television or wherever you watch things like this, which if you're watching things like this, I worry about you. It's foreign aid. We've shown over and over and over and over the calculations that foreign aid last year would only be like 12 days of borrowing. At the end of the decade, it's only like, 6-7 days of borrowing. Congressional salaries. It was 28 minutes of borrowing for a whole year. And 10 years from now, it's like 19 minutes of borrowing. The fact of the matter is, you got to stop pretending. The scale of the debt, once again, and I did this last week and the week before, the Congressional Budget Office's model said in 9 budget years, you can wipe out the entire defense of the United States, our constitutional obligation. You can wipe out all of Congress. You can wipe out the White House. You can wipe out the Supreme Court. You can wipe out every dime of spending. There's no FBI. There's no Park Service. There's nothing. No discretionary dollars at all. And you still have to borrow a couple $100 billion just to maintain the baseline services of Social Security and Medicare. And the very next year, the punchline here is the very next year it gets much uglier, because that's also the year the trust funds are empty. The Medicare Part A trust fund is gone. And that's also one of the other frauds we're seeing in the president's budget. We're going to shore up Medicare. You do understand the Medicare trust fund is only the Part A. 3/4 of the other spending of Medicare is coming already out of the general fund. So once again, that previous sentence, you got to let that one sink in. You can get rid of all discretionary spending. No more of this crap of, let's just get rid of foreign aid or waste and fraud. It's all gone. Just get rid of all of it. And in 9 years, 9 budget years, you got to borrow a couple $100 billion. And that's being optimistic that there's no recession, that all the revenues come in projection, there's no war, there's another pandemic, everything's fine. Do you understand how fragile? And then the Democrat spending is approaching 25% of the economy. Deficits. Now, this is with all the tax hikes and assuming every dime comes in, and this place is willing to vote for every one of Biden's tax hikes. You're still borrowing an average of $1.5 trillion a year, and at that 9th budget year, I think it's still like $2.3 trillion that year, because it keeps going up. Interest payments. This is right out of the president's budget. We're going to basically average over the next 10 years. The interest payments on the debt will reach $1.3 trillion a year. Just the interest. So you have the interest, then the borrowing. So if we're estimating 2033, so 9 budget years from now, if under the president's budget, forgive me, I'm doing this from memory, it's like 2.3 trillion borrow, 1.3 of that is just interest, the other trillion functionally is the growth of Medicare. And remember, the very next year, Social Security Trust Fund is gone, and our brothers and sisters are taking about a 23 to 24% cut in their check, and you've just doubled senior poverty. That's one of the things that also outrages me is where's the conversation of we're going to save Social Security, we're going to work on it together, instead of using it for the next campaign piece that the left is putting together. You're going to see also the left run around here saying, we're going to raise taxes on wealthy people to save Medicare. No, they're not. What they're going to do is actually start to add another 5 points on capital gains, the 3.8% special premium that they basically stole and put into the general fund that was originally supposed to go to Medicare. Okay, let's say they now finally stop stealing it, put it all towards the Medicare Trust Fund Part A, and now it goes up to 5 points. That's only 1/4 of Medicare spending. The model basically says, according to the president's budget, we're going to go from about $661 billion of interest borrowing to a baseline of $1.3 trillion in 9 budget years. And now we start getting into the way we try to actually model much of this debt. There are ways. There is hope. The markets around the world that like to buy U.S. debt, your pension plan, your own personal savings, your union pension plan, a state pension plan. When I was Maricopa County Treasurer, we bought it because it was safe and very liquid. We would buy U.S. T-bills, U.S. Treasuries. One of the key things you always look at is what's the debt of a country to the size of its economy. So my Democrat colleagues are running around here saying, if we get all these taxes, we're going to lower the deficits. It's just not true. But just even believing the top line that's written in the president's budget with that before we've actually had a moment to really dive in and see what the economic analytics are, and do they model for how much they're going to slow the economy down and what that does to revenues? Are they still just pretending they're still getting the baseline growth? We functionally go from 98.4% of the publicly held debt to the size of the economy to 9 budget years, we go to 110%. We're basically right on top of the World War II peak. So we're basically going to line up with the highest debt to the size of the economy in our country's history. So here's the argument I want to make. Are there things you should do to maybe bring in more receipts, more revenues? Okay, fine. Walk us through this. You know, I can find you some things in the tax code where I believe some people are cheating, are using it in ways where that's not how we meant to draft it. Fine, we'll work with you. But walk me through all the things you're going to do to grow the economy, not try to control it and management. Because so much of the legislation, particularly last year, was almost the soft nationalization of much of the economy. You can't get this grant, and actually I should probably explain this grant unless you actually go kiss up to the White House and you actually do their bidding, their sort of woke agenda. Fine. Another bit of the con you need to understand is this administration has advocated for what they call a global minimum tax. Go around the industrialized world and say, hey, we want this 15% global minimum tax. And if you're a country, if you give a refundable tax receipt because you did certain activities or tax credit, those things, that goes into the 15% calculation. Another country can tax you, tax your operations because this country did this. So do you actually understand why a bunch of the Democrats' spending last year, they made it grants? They basically played our European allies for fools. Hey, sign up for this global 15% minimum. Wink, wink, nod, nod. But grants don't count as subsidizations for businesses. And the beauty of the grants actually make the bureaucracy and whoever holds the White House dramatically more powerful. It's a soft nationalization and a way to escape their own tax extortion. So if I came to you tomorrow and said, one of our most moral obligations is we got to find a way to stabilize this national debt to the size of our economy. Okay, you got to do functionally two things. I got to bend the spending here, and I got to grow. We have to grow. Last week when I was behind this microphone, I had my 8-month-old little boy with me. Parliamentarian wouldn't let me hold him, broke my heart, but that's the rules of the rules. What's our moral obligation to him? When he turns 20, actually it's 24 now, it's a whole year later. When he turns 24, if we were going to maintain baseline services, we have to double U.S. taxes. It's demographics. We got old, and lots of our population, what is it, 67 million of our brothers and sisters, I'm one of them, will have moved into their earned benefit years. Okay. So you need a revolution in the cost of health care. I've already been behind this microphone repeatedly talking about that we're on the cusp of, but not curing, but also stabilizing diabetes. Diabetes being 33% of all healthcare spending. But lots of other great things are happening. And go look at last week's speech if you're curious. I spent the last half of it walking through things that are actually hopeful and optimistic. I don't particularly like this board because it is missing a number of things, but we're going to have to deal with the reality of our population. In 19 years, the United States has more deaths than births. You remember your high school economics class. How do you grow an economy when your population is flatlined or is sinking? You could do it through high-skill immigration. You could also do it through automation. Should we incentivize robots, just like they're doing in China and other places we compete with? You got to have a tax code that is all about growth. How do you say expensing? Remember, when we had the 100% expensing that we did in the 2017 tax reform, the economists said that may have been the number one thing that helped us grow the economy, and you don't lose revenues from it. You actually gain revenues. It's a timing effect. If I say, hey, you get to have expensing, but you got to do it over 7 years, or you can do it all today, it's still the same deduction. It's about the time. And because you let them do it today, it puts you in a cycle where, hey, I'm going to buy the next piece of efficiency on the equipment sooner. And so the model said if you look at a longer horizon, you actually get more revenues by making so you can have 100% expensing today, because it forces you into a cycle where you're constantly trying to get to the next level of productivity with your capital investments. Ideas like that in the tax code are elegant because it raises wages. It grows the economy. Remember, we're trying to actually stabilize our debt to the GDP. And the last one, and I probably should come back in the next couple of weeks and demonstrate, I believe we could have a revolution in regulation. And I'm going to try to visualize this one. So everyone work with me, and if you get bored, I think I have a YouTube video from years ago I put together, a little cartoon that basically says, I think it's under Schweikert environmental crowdsourcing, and it's a simple concept. When you walk, you want to open a motorcycle paint shop or a bakery or whatever the hell it is, and you need your air quality permit. Let's just do it this way, air quality permit. So you fill out lots of paperwork, you hire a consultant, you design your scrubbers, and then you walk into your county air quality office and you file paperwork. Does a file cabinet full of paperwork make the air quality in your community better? Huh? No, basically documentation so the trial lawyer can sue you. How about if you in your community had a little sensor, had a few thousand people driving around your community. I'm from a huge county. Had a sensor, and if there's idiots over here painting motorcycles in the back of their yard and not doing it in a booth, okay, fine. You catch them immediately. You crowdsource the data. You don't need an army of bureaucrats watching the file cabinets and then hiring armies of consultants. You could crowdsource. You basically put the sensors on, let people, give it to the Uber drivers, give it to the UPS drivers, and say, hey, we really care more about where we have a problem, and if there's a problem, we'll go and fix it, than punishing everyone in our marketplace. The people are following the rules, the elegance of this, they get left alone. You don't have to deal with government, you get left alone. And if you screw up, you get caught. That's the use of technology. It's just one very simple idea, but there's dozens and dozens like that. You could drop the size of the bureaucracy. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, I appreciate the tolerance. May I request the time?
The gentleman has 19 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Look, for everyone who's been willing to give me part of their time, I'm just trying to make a couple simple points. We have a fiscal responsibility and blame for inflation. We could do policies on pieces of legislation that say, we're going to actually help. How about a piece of legislation? Actually, guess what? I already have this one. That basically says, how do I pull liquidity out of the marketplace but not hurt people? How about actually give every American a spiff for taking some cash out of their checking account instead of running out and buying a new colored television, even though the televisions are beautiful, put it in their retirement account. You actually slow down consumption over here, you shore up their retirement security, and it's almost the exact same thing the Federal Reserve is doing. There's things we can do policy-wise that would help knock down inflation. We have a handful of bills like that. The other thing is the reality of we've been lied to on the scoring of the Democrats' spending from last year, and we're starting to see it now. And third thing I want to point out is the dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of tax hikes. And then the White House is pretending it's not going to change the economic velocity. They're going to get all these revenues, and they're still going to spend like crazy. And not within there, the morality of, are they going to step up and help us save Social Security? The morality of it, are they going to actually help us grow the economy? Because if it's unacceptable that their big accomplishment will still be over 110% debt to GDP in 9 years. It's unacceptable. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, I want to yield back, or should I yield to Mr. Cloud?
You can yield.